Well, welcome back to another episode, and this time it's the BMW Z4. Now, this one's a little bit exciting because I was supposed to do a different car this week, and I thought, you know what, the Z4 is a car I really, really want to do. But there's no way I could do the Z4 without first doing the BMW Z3. So I'm going to do a quick run through of the Z3. It's one of the really interesting cars within the lineup of BMW because it has almost every engine variation going in the brand at the time, and I think it was because when it was first released, BMW kind of saw it as a car that needed to be marked sort of down away from their performance cars. And then as time moved on, they realised that a slightly larger engine would encourage more buyers. And in fact, there was the option for a performance model. Let's just cover the one quickly and then we'll move on to the Z4s. So the Z3, it has a 1.8, a 1.9, a 2 litre, a 2.2, a 2.3, a 2.5, a 3 litre, and a 3.2. It's a huge array of engines. And if you look at the very, very first ones that will be available to you, they are likely either a 1.8 or a 1.9. So they're sort of smaller engine, 4-cylinder vehicles. For some of you, you won't even know about these vehicles, and that's because you only get the larger vehicles, and that comes in at around the year 2000, roughly. The ones that sort of stick in my mind, and obviously these will be now sort of modern classic vehicles, you know, some of them are from the 90s, and it really is going to come down to condition. What I would say is when I was in the trade, these were still they were still a premium car to trade in. You know, they weren't sort of that old that they'd possibly fallen into the wrong hands or whatever else, or someone who was wanting the performance but not quite the costs. And so back then, we would always try and sell anything that was either 2.3, 3 litre, or the smaller engines. For whatever reason, on these early Z3s, the smaller engines, they get quite a lot of love. And I think it's just because first one's out, made an impression, and then as the production years go through, even though the bigger engines come out and are available to people, doesn't quite coax those sort of early buyers when they come to refresh their car. Critical to know, 2000 is a real sort of notable year for the Z3. 2000 to the end of production is when they step up their game for power. So if you want a Z3 and if you want something with a bit higher power, you're going to need to looking for 2000 onwards. From driving them, you know, it's difficult, and I think the difficulty for me is I know a lot of you watching are from around the world, which is absolutely fantastic, but with the Z3, BMW did what sometimes you'll see when I do the guides, and I have to sort of say this engine plus this engine plus this engine, but these ones are not available in all markets. And it's a very, very similar story on the Z3. Not so bad once we step into the Z4s, but for a lot of you watching, there's just going to be certain engines that I mention and you're like, we just didn't get them. If you can get the 2.5, it's a really nice sort of middle ground between the top power model and the sort of the lower power models. Still got a really nice soundtrack on the 2.5, and they're just a little bit unloved, a bit like the 2.3 is. Of the smaller engines, I don't think there's a lot in it from driving them. I think there's a few things, sort of reliability, other things like that. But I would say if this is just going to be a weekend car and you can look at, say, the 1.9, go on a condition rather than anything else. And it's because when I used to deal with modern classics, when I was dealing with the classic cars before I moved into sort of modern car media, you would find that anything in the 90s, what generally happened was they went through a period in the 2000s, particularly between 2008 and 2012, where they fell into two categories actually. I shouldn't say they all fell into this. They either fell into the category of starting to be desirable, people really liked them, technology was coming into cars, and the more analog 90s cars started to get a lot of love, their prices started to increase, and all of a sudden some of the bigger service bills that went with them suddenly became worth it. That was one section of cars. And then the other ones, they were old, they were less desirable than the newer ones, they were less fuel efficient, they didn't deliver anything particularly special compared to a car from, say, 2010. And so sort of people were looking more into sort of 2005 onwards cars and didn't value those 90s cars at that point. Some owners just kept them because they loved them and they didn't care about, you know, what the value was. Other owners, you know, they got that big bill and they just said, well, I'll just do this, that, and the other to get it through, with the idea that it would eventually be worth nothing. If you find one of those cars for sale, just be a little bit wary of it. Now, The last one I'll mention on the Z3 before we jump over to the Z4s is they do an M model. M model is quite special on this. They will probably be priced quite highly whether you are, unless you are in the US. If you're in the US, you got the treatment that unfortunately a lot of US buyers got in sort of the 90s and 2000s, where the first iteration that you get, so I think this is the would this be about 99 model, 2000 model, you get a ZM model that doesn't have the M engine. Now you do get it, I think it's 2002 going into 2003. So BMW sort of right their ways, and they realised that while the Europeans and some of the markets that get European specification vehicles, so thinking like South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, generally get European specified vehicles, there's usually not a great deal of difference because of how regulators and legislation works. There are sometimes, but in sports cars, not so much. You probably do have just the M engine if you're in those markets. If you're in the US, first couple of years, if you notice that they're a lot cheaper, it's because it's not a proper M engine in there, and it's about 80-ish horsepower shy of then the next model year, where they give it a proper M engine for that sign off of the Z3, and they move it for about 18 months. So if you want the ultimate version, if you're in the US, you've got to look right at the end of the production period, probably the last year, and then you're guaranteed to get that nicer engine. If you're in Europe, you can look at all the years. And one thing I would say is, this is just from working in classic cars. This isn't specific to BMW or the Z range. You'll find that the first year of production, for the first 20 years of a car's life, it's the one that I'll generally say, if you can go for the second year, go for the second year rather than the first, because it's sort of the teething issue year. It's when the brand realizes that, perhaps, I'll give you a really silly example. They can be using a particular set of suspension springs, and then they realize after the first year that actually the compression they were hoping that those springs would keep after a year on the road from their testing don't really materialize, and they have to then change the specification of the springs. Things like that are much more common when you're talking about 80s cars, 90s cars, and before then, than they are from about, sort of early 2000s. After that, you have a lot of CAD design coming in, you have a lot of change and non-destructive testing for components. Just to be honest, if you're interested in vehicles, it's a fascinating period of time in the sort of very, very late 90s, going in to the sort of 2010s, that period of automotive technology, because there's so much innovation that's happening, so much old school design, and those old school engineers are still in a job. They might be a bit older in their career, but they remember the 70s, and then they're being shown all these new ways of doing things, and you can see we really get the best out of mechanical vehicles. These the Z3s will be just on the end of the old way of looking at things, but from a collector point of view, from the sort of classic car point of view, the first year of production actually becomes valuable again. So you'll spend 20 years of these cars being sort of a little bit undesirable, and then they'll go into the classic world, and all of a sudden you've got chassis, 1050. And because it's a low chassis number, it suddenly becomes worth something. Is that going to be something that really makes a difference to the price you're going to pay today? Not so much, but just be aware of it, because if you're thinking of long-term ownership and keeping it, you have to remember that, like any car, in another 10 years, probably 20-30% of the Z3 range will be gone. Another 20 years from then, probably 50%. There is always a factor within classics, though, that eventually people just don't want them anymore. So I would own them to enjoy them. Don't own them as investments, especially these type of cars. But if you are going to pay the big money for the sort of Z3M model, then just keep that in mind. The exception is going to be that first year of the Z3M in the US with the non-M engine. I don't think that will become particularly desirable at any point. Could be wrong, so you can ignore me all you like, but just sort of giving you a little bit of insight from when I worked with classic cars. Let's move over to the Z4s now. And the first generation Z4, this is the E89, E85 generation. Very interesting vehicle, this one. So this is sort of prime for when I was sort of moving into the most trade as a very young guy. And you would drive these, and they drove like... There's very actually few cars I can say that were similar to this, because they had the old school way. And it's only as I went through my career and started to drive more classic cars that I understood where BMW were coming from when they built the Z4, because, and the Z3 before it. It doesn't really feel like a lot of the sort of sports cars. So the Porsche Boxster feels very different. The Mazda MX-5, despite it having front engine, rear wheel drive, sort of chassis balance very equal, it still doesn't feel the same as a Z4 in this generation. These Z4s feel like you're driving it from the rear wheels. Great handling on the front, but they have something that has completely disappeared from cars today. Because of that, they are quite desirable if you really love driving. And we live in a world where the idea of selling a car to someone who loves driving has become such a small part of the market. I would say we're down to maybe 2%, maybe probably 1% realistically of what the industry believes that people demand and that are delivering on. And because it is in that couple of percent, it's why we only really have the Mazda MX-5 left, or Miata in your market, it could be, for the sort of true driving enthusiast that isn't all about speed and 0 to 60 times, but is about trying to get down that country lane or the canyon or whatever they drive through as quickly as they can to their level of skill on the road within some interpretation of the limits. The Z4 in this generation, it really delivers on that. So if you're someone like that and you've been thinking, I've had new cars for a while, I'd really like to just have something at home that I can enjoy that isn't the fastest thing on four wheels, but I can take it at a weekend, get the roof down possibly, drive it and feel like the engineer is sort of beside me and going, yeah, this is how we wanted it used. Good. It's just one of those cars. And I speak very nicely about it just because when we step into the next generation, that has to fade somewhat because new regulations come in. This generation doesn't mean the next generation's bad, by the way. It just means that in this generation, there is something a little bit special to be had. So, engines. You have the smallest engine, which I'll come on to last because it doesn't come in at the early point. Essentially, it's a bunch of 6-cylinder engines, so this is very common if you know your BMWs. The 2.2, 2.5, 3 litre. Of these, having driven all of them, I think it's the 3 litre gets 6-speed manual gearbox throughout. If, by the way, you want a lot of details on this, there is a buyer's guide. It will be linked probably below. I'll probably already put a card up so you can get all the specific details on the car. But from memory, it's a 6-speed on the 3 litre, which doesn't come on the 2.5 and the 2.2. However, you still get the 6-cylinder soundtrack with those vehicles. And actually, the 3 litre is great. It is. There's no question of it. And it's the one you'll pay the most money for. But if you're thinking, well, budget might be a little bit tight, or because it's not going to be your main car, you don't really want to spend sort of top money for the nicest one you can find, and possibly you want to even enjoy it on a racetrack. A lot of people overlook the 2.2 because the 2.5 is there and the 2.5 bumps up power a little bit more. But honestly, 170-ish brake horsepower, put some sort of super unleaded V-Power Shell fuel in there, and drive it, and really drive it. And, unless you live in a place where people are very lax about the speed laws around you, which it's pretty much nowhere these days. Everyone's realised you can put a camera up and make a lot of money from it. Not saying that we should all drive at whatever speed we want, but, there's interpretations of trying to be reasonable on the road. That 2.2 will keep you within most of those sort of reasonable speeds that you can drive at whilst really enjoying the car. The idea of just singing an engine out all the way to its red line, outside of motoring journalism, it's kind of gone. There are, of course, there's motoring clubs and people will talk about this, but doing it on the road has become more and more difficult with newer and newer cars, especially with turbocharging. And so the 2.2, it's a little bit of a lighter engine, only slightly, than the 2.5 and the 3 litre, but you can really sort of drive the legs off of it and not get as far as the 3 litre. The 3 litre guy is always going faster than you, but then they do an M model in this generation, so someone's always going faster than him. But there is that element of, it depends what you're buying the car for. So if it's something that you want to drive, but you're not sort of, I'm at the limit type of person, then 2.2 probably won't be for you. The 2.5 is a really nice middle ground because it can do a bit of cruising, it can do a little bit of performance, but it's not top end money of the 3 litre. The 3 litre by far and away the most desirable. They do an SI model towards the end of production. Just a great car. And it has a lot of elements that make it feel like BMW wanted to just sort of nudge it up a bit closer to being an M car. I think in the modern BMW era, that would have been sort of a, well, they have a Z4M, but if you know BMWs, you have now like an M badge before the regular badging on their cars that are the sort of sport and separated from the rest of the range, but they're not quite an M car. That's the badge that this one could have had, that SI model, if they were doing that sort of scheme at the time. Now, there is the Z4M. And the Z4M, it will be a collector's car, it will be a modern classic, it's awesome to drive. However, I would always lean over to the coupe model rather than the convertible. Convertible's a great drive, no question, but there are elements from the M3 and M3 CSL that get put into the Roadster or the coupe that don't get put into the convertible for packaging reasons and for a few other sort of aspects. BMW looking at the potential owners and realising the convertible Z4M buyer may not be as bothered as the sort of coupe guy that wants to just go as fast as possible, or lady, of course. So that sort of wraps up the E85, but there is the overlooked car. And this is the 2 litre model. It's the 4-cylinder N46 engine. Look, from the point of view of the engine, not hugely inspiring. Hasn't got the sound of the 6 cylinders. Even if you put, you know, larger exhaust on it and all these sort of induction modifications, it's still a 4-cylinder. There's no getting around for it. But if you've got the roof down, honestly, there's other enjoyment to have from the car than the noise. And I know some people are big into the noise. That's fine. You can go for the 6 cylinders. But there is an enjoyment from 150 horsepower, which is probably just the very edge of what this car could have in it and still feel quick. The main reason it feels a bit sharper than the larger engine models is because of the smaller engine. It has a lighter sort of front end to it. And the very front, if you open the bonnet on a Z4 and you look underneath in the 6 cylinders, you get this sort of this run of cylinders towards you, and it sort of comes quite close to you. When you look at the 4-cylinder, it's buried back there. You know, unless you're tall like me, you sort of lean forward and you're really having to struggle to work on it. You have to go around the sides, and that's the main way to get access. But to drive, they're so overlooked. And they're overlooked because they're the least powerful, they don't have the inspiring engine tone of the other models, and you have to be on it all the time. You know, they do not feel that fast when you're just sort of easing your way into the throttle. But I'm telling you, 150 horsepower and a manual gearbox in a car with rear-wheel drive and a lighter chassis shell to it because it's carrying a lighter engine, it reminds me more so of the classic cars. You know, if you've ever driven any sort of classic roadster vehicle, they're not quick. They feel fast. I mean, when you're driving in some of these cars, MGB without a V8, which is the majority of them, they feel like you go through those gearing if you can find a good enough one that you can really drive hard on the road. And you're like, God, I'm going some. And then you look down at the speedo and you're not going some. You're barely troubling the sort of SUV behind you that is just trying to get past you with its twin turbo V8. No, but you feel the exhilaration of it. Step forward, and we kind of lose that from a lot of cars. And this probably is one of the last sort of on sale throughout the world that actually has that sort of exhilaration to it. But it is only going to be for the driver, the person that every time they get in the car wants to sort of have that exhilaration, have that drive. Because if you're just sort of cruising around in it, yeah, it doesn't deliver on some of the other aspects that say a 2.2 would do with the 6-cylinder. That just gives you the nice sound, gives you that bit extra torque for your everyday going about. So you've got to be a bit more committed if you want the 2-litre. But for those of you who do, you can usually get them a little bit cheaper. And although you will suffer with having to search the market a bit longer for a good one, because they were the ones that got, I don't want to say they were on like the cheap lease deal sort of stuff, but they were bought at a lower cost. People who are not that interested in perhaps the driving bought them, not every time, but from what I saw at least on the sort of 3-year to 5-year trading period, was that these cars generally were owned by people who liked a convertible for the summer and were not bothered to get something with a bit higher power or higher cost. They come into most markets in 2005 and end in 2008, so they do the last run of production, just so you know. It's just an interesting aspect, and if you're looking at a 2.2 and you can't find a good one, don't let other people put you off and just say the 2 litre is rubbish. Go and have a drive. If you don't like it, you don't like it. But don't just dismiss it, because it can be quite fun to drive. Let's move forward then, the E89 generation. Now, a few of you who watch a lot of my videos and watch all the buyer's guides that I do will know that this one is my wife's, one of her favourite cars. She was very seriously about to buy one. If we'd probably been dealing with a better salesman years ago, she would have bought it. But in the end, being sensible took over, and she got herself a hot hatchback. So she got something a bit fun, but this really was close to taking her heart. And it's a car that she, when she worked at BMW for a period, when she'd sort of come out of university and was getting her first jobs, they gave her one of these, and it was what she brought onto our first date. So you can imagine my look of, I was driving some sort of old shed that I'd picked up after yeah, whatever it was, and parked at the back of the car park, and she turned up in a Z4, and I thought, this is an interesting person here. Either she's very into cars, or we're not going to be much of a match with how things are. Fortunately, it was the former, and she was very into cars and really happy that she'd got this car for the weekend. She will tell you 2 litre turbo. That's the one that she really liked, because from her point of view, she's not someone that likes to be revving out an engine constantly. She's not so bothered about the sound. She thought the 2 litre gave it enough noise for her. And so, depending on who you are, if you're watching this, if you want a Z4 that's going to be nice to look at, you can be happy with it on your driveway, give it a nice wash at the weekend, drop the roof, and still have the performance, the 2 litre turbo is a really good option for this. It's a great option for those people, okay? And fortunately, on the used market, the 2 litre, along with the the 23 model, which has a 2.5 naturally aspirated, they don't get as much love. Don't know why. That's something maybe you'll know and you can tell me in the comments. But generally speaking, they get a little bit of less attention. Now, that could be because in some markets they're not allowed to have the very top specification until later in the production. So that could be it. I know in the UK that wasn't such an issue. Don't think that was an issue in Australia either when I was there. You could get it as a M Sport or Sport model, have the nicer wheels and most of the trim, and you got better fuel economy for the majority of time you were driving it, unless you were, like the person before, always wanting something you could sprint out of the gate in. If that's you, there is a 2.5 and a 3 litre naturally aspirated. Those N52 motors, they are sort of bringing in from an older generation. They end here. This is sort of the end of their lifespan, if you like, end of the time when BMW can still put them in cars and pass all the types of emissions and everything else that need to be done with these cars. And honestly, it's a huge loss. It is. It's a huge loss to the industry that we now don't even have the option of these naturally aspirated engines. And I know some of you will be like, well, I don't care. We've got big power turbo motors now. We've got more efficient engines. And of course, I understand that. For the majority of people, the engines that we have today, which are smaller, more efficient, and just as powerful, although delivering it in a different way with sort of torquey turbo sort of power behind them, rather than this sort of zinging, naturally aspirated, push the engine all the way to the top. But people voted with their money. That's the reality of this. BMW do not sell as many of the 2.5 and 3 litres in all of the specifications. So it's 23, 25, 30, all I models. Yeah, they just don't sell the number that they were expecting to. They do sell a lot more of the top model and the bottom model than they were expecting. And those are both turbocharged engines. So this is the world we live in. It's the market we have to accept. However, it doesn't mean that on the used market, you can't find yourself a really good deal on those 2.5 and 3 engines. Honestly, I'd probably just go for the entry. I think in quite a lot of markets, you'll have a 23i, which will be a 2.5 6-cylinder. I'd just drive that. It's going to give you the soundtrack. You can always put a sort of slightly fruity exhaust on it if you want a little bit more However, most of these engines, I think in the guide actually I put exhaust test up and I just showed a few clips. What you'll find from the majority of them is they've got a reasonable sound from factory when you want it. They're pretty silent and muted when you don't want it. If you go for something aftermarket, you probably just want to step things up 10, maybe 15%, because the other engines with these six-cylinder motors, what happens is you start to get a bit of resonance come through and you kind of lose the tune of the engine, and instead you get noise. And some people love noise. Most people I know love tune, and you have to be sort of an exhaust specialist to really know the point where you're stepping over, and you have to be really, really good. And like, to be honest, I only know one person, in fact, that I've worked with throughout the years who really knows tune more than noise. And they'll sort of say, no, you don't want to go for this brand, you want this brand, and sometimes it's not ones that you've heard of. And you try it out and you think, yeah, they have a good point, yeah. That's just a side tip. There's loads of people out there that will give you loads of modification advice on this. It's not really what I do. What I would say is, for most people, it's a huge loss that we don't have an M model on this generation. However, with that 3-litre twin turbo, what is it, it's S54 engine on this, you're going to be fine. You're going to be able to enjoy yourself, and for the most part, you've probably got an over-engined car for the chassis beneath you. And what I mean by that is that you'll be able to use about 60-70% of the performance of the engine, and you'll get all of what you want from the car, unless you're someone who's a big enthusiast for the track, or you're stepping out of something with higher horsepower and you're trying to sort of make a middle ground approach between going down something that you've always got to be on the button to get the power out of, like a VTEC style engine, and away from sort of a big V8 that's always lazily there for power. This kind of sits somewhere in the middle, but it is powerful for what it is. I know 300 horsepower, it just doesn't sound that much anymore, does it? And you've got 700 horsepower electric cars doing 0 to 60 in a few seconds. People have kind of lost this attention to it, but honestly, in the Z4 market, you're better off just enjoying the car. And if it's going to be the 3-litre with the turbos, great. Just be aware that, the smaller engine can still give you a lot of the thrill. It's not going to give you the very top end of it. And of course, I'm like many enthusiasts, I want top model, but I sort of accept when someone comes along and say, oh no, I didn't go for that one. I went for the middle one so I could enjoy it a bit more on the road. It didn't used to be an argument back in, say, the 80s. In the 80s, the top model was still, you're having to thrash it out. Now, I think the top model is probably a little bit more than what most people need on the road, but what we all still want. So from here, let's go to the next generation, the G29. Before we do, I just realised I mentioned about that 3-litre turbo engine. And I forgot to say that there is, I've forgotten the designation it gets, but there is a 340 brake horsepower version that comes out late in the game. So if you want to go top trumps, then that's the one to go for. So there's a 300 horsepower. That would, 300 horsepower for all your tracks, all of your sort of fast roads. It really depends on countries a little bit here, and maybe I'm a little bit biased because I've got a little bit too used to the sort of country roads that I go to when I want to go and enjoy a car, rather than sort of some of the open sweeping roads that you'll have if you're maybe in the US or Australia or Canada, where you've got a little bit more sort of space around you and you haven't got some of the tighter turns that we have here. Then yeah, probably the 300 horsepower, that will give you the thrill, whereas the other ones, they'll still do it, but maybe you'll feel like you're moving a bit slower along the road. It really depends what the roads are around you. I know some of you on the east coast of the US, probably not such a big problem. You can probably find some tight twisties, and certainly if you're watching in the UK and you're in Wales, Scotland, the north of England, down in the southwest, places like that, yeah, then you've got lots of options for that sort of stuff. G29 generation. This is the last generation, and if I'm honest, I don't really see it being replaced. I think BMW have said some things, they've said other things. We're in a very weird space in the sort of car world at the moment, especially for these enthusiast cars, because demand is dropping constantly every single year. People like you that come here to watch me talk about these cars and then think, oh yeah, I might actually go and go for that one, or I'm going to start saving up in the piggy bank to go and get one. You're becoming a smaller and smaller aspect of the market for new cars, and it makes it really difficult for me to sit here and sort of blame the industry when they're being sort of forced into a corner. Regulators are stopping them with a lot of these sort of safety limits, safety testing, restricted numbers. You can only sort of get exemptions if you're in the sort of Ferrari world of low volume, and it's pushed it so that unless the enthusiasts turn up en masse, which for a variety of reasons we won't go into here, but people are not showing up in the ways they used to for these cars. So, as many of you will know, this is the BMW Z4 Toyota Supra. It's a joint venture between the two companies, and honestly, some people thought that was a negative. I thought that was fantastic because it's resulted in two cars that just may have never come back otherwise. Certainly, I don't think the Supra would have come back on its own. It would have probably had to wait another decade and would have been an electric type of vehicle, maybe a hybrid. But this allowed it to exist, and I think we have to celebrate that as a car community. The engine that comes from it is a corker. It's one of... I don't really see how there's mixed opinion on it, because it's one of the best engines that's come out of BMW for a long time from a standpoint of reliability, tunability and power, and the same for Toyota. And you can kind of understand when I looked into this prior, well actually I looked into it years ago when I was in a different part of media, but the development of this engine took such an effort between the two companies because of course BMW are known more for their performance offering and their sort of sturdiness, whereas Toyota are known to sell you something with headroom for performance but longevity to it. You know, that no Toyota should be getting sold and not lasting 20 years in Toyota's eyes. And so that meant that what you had was one company pushing the boundaries of what they thought they could deliver with an engine, another company sort of saying, well, actually, I think we need to over-engineer this bit, this bit, this bit, this bit, because that will give it a bit of headroom for longevity. And if people want to then sort of pump up the power, they can do. And another company that's sort of like, yeah, okay, we didn't really, you know, we've designed it to its limits and we've left the headroom we would usually leave, but predominantly the European tuning scene relies on bolt-on modifications. The Japanese tuning scene usually goes way beyond that with power modifications historically. And so there was a little bit of, if people are driving 1,000 horsepower Supras from the 90s, we need to sell them something today that can at least sort of compete. It doesn't have to be going 1,000 horsepower, but it needs to have the headroom so that engine tuners aren't saying, no, you can't push it very hard, it cracks the block. Because of that, you get a fantastic engine, and from BMW's point of view, they then have the B48. So the engine I'm talking about is the B58. It's used now across BMW's lineup. Pretty much every single BMW that isn't electric has a B58 option in it. From there, you have the 4-cylinder. Again, some little bit of shared engineering going on here. Maybe a bit less so than the B58, but that's a 2-litre turbocharged engine. And I would say it depends who you are. Okay, so I mentioned in the guide the first sort of 5 years. First 4 years of production, definitely you're not going to get manual options. Manual options then come in late in the day. They're about 2024. You may have a 2023 build in 2024 model year. Really depends where you are in the world. But the point is, if you want something you can enjoy and you're not too bothered about having a manual gearbox, you can go for the first 4 years of production. If not, then you've got to go late in the day. If you're someone that wants the ultimate version, you've only got to look at the B58, but it is pricey. No way of getting around it. They're not going to sell enough units to sort of have economies of scale like they may have done on the 85 model. So it's where we are in the world. And can we blame BMW for that? You know, it just is what it is. From the point of what you want to know, and that's the enjoyment factor, honestly, I don't have an issue with the automated gearbox on these. I think it's a good gearbox, the ZF gearbox, it does the job. And predominantly for most of you that buy the car and that are going to use it partially, maybe you're going to use it sort of a bit more every day than you would some of the older ones, you probably will find you'll enjoy it that little bit more with having some paddle shifts that you can enjoy when you want to, but let the car do the rest of it when you want. For the small number of you that are just that die-hard enthusiasts, love the mechanical connection, you need to wait for the manuals to come out a bit later on in the day. And from BMW's point of view, I think they'll restrict the supply a little bit. I think you can just walk in and order one, but they can do it in non-direct means by sort of putting the orders further and further back. Not because they want to. There'll be an emissions aspect to that. The manuals have slightly higher CO2 emissions, but when you're talking about fleet averages and everything else, it's made it an impossible scenario for most manufacturers. And so, if you want to enjoy one, you can go for the 3 litre, but I would have a serious look at that 4 litre turbo. The main, 4-cylinder turbo. 4 litre turbo, that'd be good, wouldn't it? The 4-cylinder turbo on this, it does a lot of things that most people will want from a Z4. It's quick, it's great to drive on most roads. It is a little bit stiff, so I think if you're used to some of the older models that came with some of the smaller wheels and thicker tyres, this will probably be a little bit stiffer because they've basically taken away all of the specification except the sort of sport and then into the M Sport with the 3 litre. Again, it's just where we are in the motoring world. If you can go for a 20 model, I'd look for the first half of the year's production. I think 21 was a little bit difficult for the brand. Again, you've got different manufacturers, you've got different suppliers, and you've got partially them being sort of halfway around the world from the original design of the engine. Because of that, just for me, I would probably look at 19, 20, and then 22. Nothing wrong with the 21s, but I think you've just got to give them that little bit more of an inspection. And also, from the depreciation curve point of view, the 22s will now be coming off their 3-year leases for those people that did buy them in 22 and got them on a 3-year lease. The 21s would have probably just already come off of that, and so the ones you're going to be buying are the stock that's left around, the 4-year leases, which there will be some, depending on the country you live in, and the ones that have possibly had a few owners. And lots of owners on performance cars doesn't worry me as much as some people, and that's because when you go into the classic car world, some cars have had 25 owners, and it's just like, well, that's the car. People own it for a year, enjoy it for a year, move it on. And the next person owns it for a year, and then they've said they've owned it, and then they move it on. The car is still a good car. It still gets its service that year. It still gets money spent on it. And as long as you're looking at one of those, you're absolutely fine. The trouble for me is when cars get moved around very early on, so sort of, let's say it had an owner for 1 year, an owner for 1.5 years, an owner for 2 years, and now you're looking at being the 4th owner, got to make sure that throughout that, the servicing and the tyres and the brakes were all getting the attention they needed. Because sometimes it sits in the industry, and I'll be honest with you, I worked in the car industry for a number of years. These type of cars, when they're in the industry for a few months, they sometimes get pinched by, one of the salesmen or the salesman's manager, son or whatever else for a month. And of course, it's not their car. And they get driven a little bit harder than they should. It shouldn't really affect a modern car, but is that what you want to buy? Not particularly, is it? It's unfortunately, that's just the world we live in. Like, we can't change it. The most appealing cars are always going to be the one that get run around by people who don't have to pick up the service bill. If you can find one that's sort of a one owner, they've just got that little bit extra bit of attention. And if they've been told, well, the tyres are looking a little bit low, do you want to wait 6 months, or do you want to do them now and get the top brand on them and we can order them in for next week? That person who was planning on keeping them probably just did the job. Get it done. I don't want to be waiting here in the middle of June for you to order me some tyres. Order them in January, and then I can enjoy my car in the summer. Those are the sort of owners you want to try and buy off if you can. Pick of them, we're not going to get another one. The 3 litre is going to live on in history, I think. And I think in a few years' time, when this is finally gone, and you can't buy it anymore, a Z4 driving the way it does, with a 3 litre turbocharged engine, and a manual gearbox, you'd be spending a lot of money today. However, going forwards, I think you'll realise you have something of incredible value. You're not going to buy another one. Not for less than 6 figures from a specialist manufacturer who's knocking out, say, 500 a year from probably a shed in the southwest of England, or from sort of Derby, Leicester region, or, the old sort of British manufacturers of knock them together in a shed, which has got better over the years, but do it in low numbers and give people what they enjoy. Those are probably going to be where you'll have to look at in 3, 4, 5 years' time. So you can get one of those. If you can't, go for a 2 litre. you'll still love it. You'll still love it. That wraps up the Z4. Not sure which car I'll move on to next. I think I've got a few on the book that needs to be done, but I wanted to do this one because as I'm releasing it, sort of that real sort of deep dark bit of winter, and a few of you are thinking to yourself, oh, summer's coming up and I really want to, think of summer, roof down, cruising. Of course, if you're watching this in Australia, it's completely opposite for you. You're living towards the end of your summer period. So good time to get this video. But for those of you who are going to sit indoors and scroll Auto Trader or Cars and Bids or whatever it may be, I thought I'd do this video for you guys. So I hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, maybe consider subscribing and have a good day. I'll see you next time.